Morning. Got a question for you. Has anyone ever undertaken the project of building a house? Raise your hand if you've ever done that. Okay, a lot of you actually have. I've never done it, but I did stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night, so some of you remember that, some of you don't. Okay. So I have friends who are contractors, that's what they do for a living, and so they build houses all the time. And I talked to some people, and I think even some of you who have been general contractors on your own house build. I was looking into that once, so I sat down and talked with some people that had done it. And here's what I learned in that process. That's a lot to take on. There's a lot of details, it's a very, deliberate process. And everyone knows, I think, that the first and most important part of building a house is, the foundation. Even if you're like me and you've never built a home before, you probably still understand that foundations are important. In fact, a failing foundation is the biggest risk that you take when you invest into a home, into a property of any kind. That's why we collectively dish out over $4 billion a year to maintain and repair our foundations. Lindsay and I love old houses, and so we've looked at a lot of old houses over the years, considering like this might be something that we purchased. And many of the ones that we looked at, they were just beautiful on the outside, had amazing character on the inside, but they had some issues underneath the surface, and for that, for us, that was always a deal breaker. That's a lot to take on. I think everybody kind of understands that, right? That houses must be built on a solid foundation. But it's also true of other things. Other things have to be built on solid foundations, like financial systems, for example. If the financial system is not built on a solid ground, what happens? It crashes. It just happens, and we've seen that happen a few times in history. It's true of businesses. Jim Collins, who is a renowned researcher and writer, wrote a book called How the Mighty Fall, where he researched some of these companies that were kind of considered by all of their competitors to be too big to fail, right? Well, what happened was that they failed. All of these companies that he writes about actually did end up failing. See, even when foundations are expertly laid, they tend to settle in and they tend to shift. And so they require that we examine them from time to time. So these companies did not do that, and then they crashed with a mighty fall. That's why it's called How the Mighty Fall. The same is true of nations. Okay, the same is true of relationships. Every wise husband or wife is keen to potential cracks in the foundation of their relationship. So is every wise business leader and every wise professor and every wise politician, because there are tons of them. Makes it a discipline to examine the foundations that they're building everything on. That's what wise people do. They say, I'm building this thing, and so I need to make sure that what I'm building on is a solid foundation. But what about our lives? What about our lives? What kind of foundation are they built on? That's the question that Jesus decides to raise at the end of his teaching that we've been studying now for the last 11 weeks, called the Sermon on the Mount. We're in Matthew chapter 7, starting in verse 24. It's only 4 verses today that we're going to be looking at. Here's what Jesus says. Everyone then who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise man who built his house on rock. The rain fell, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall because it had been founded on rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. So building a house, a really cool metaphor for building a life. There are parts of houses that we see, right? Parts of houses that we don't see. The parts that we see are the ones we're impressed by. So think about this. You're driving down the road, and you see a house that you like. It's a huge house, beautiful house, unique house, whatever. So you point at it, and you say, wow, look at that house, or I wish I had a house like that, or I really like that house. Well, we're making those determinations solely based on what? What we see, right? We're not looking at the foundations when we make those observations. We're looking at the part above the ground. Now, granted, in our part of the world in 2018, it's a pretty reasonable assumption that, these big houses that are being built everywhere around here, they're probably being built on solid foundations. But guess what? We can't assume that about life. A life that is big, a life that looks beautiful, a life that is unique above the surface actually doesn't require a solid foundation below. And that's what we're going to get into today. But first, what is a foundation? What is a foundation? Well, basically, it's a starting point. It's a thing that is below the surface that provides strength and stability to the things that are built on top of it. That's what a foundation is, very simply. And so in this story, Jesus tells, there's one man who builds on a foundation of rock, and the other builds his house on sand. Now, when we think of sand, we tend to think of the beach. Right? Did the beach come into your mind when you heard this? No? Okay. You guys are smarter than me. Okay. But when I think of sand, I tend to think of the beach. And if you've ever tried running on that kind of sand or doing anything productive on that kind of sand, you're thinking how dumb that this second person must have been. Like, who would build a house on something like that and expect it to even last one night? So it's here where our cultural differences kind of can get in the way. Because in Israel, the sand that Jesus is referencing is very, very hard in the summer months. Beach sand is well sorted, as they call it, and alluvial sand, that's the type of sand that they have, is not. So it's very possible to build a house on this sand in the summer months and feel like you've got a solid structure, right? Because the ground is very hard. Very hard. It even feels like a rock. If you get down and push on it, it feels like a rock. You can't stick your finger down in it like you can, at the beach. It's really hard sand. So you construct this house and you think, I've built this house on a very solid foundation. But those who really wanted to build something that lasted would have had the hard work of actually digging down through the layer of hard, packed-in sand to reach the bedrock underneath. That's the difference between these two people in the story. The one person, the wise man, did the hard work of digging down through that hard surface, asking questions about the future. That's what he's thinking about, the future. The foolish man did what was easy without asking very many questions. I'm afraid that a lot of people are like that, right? We live our lives, we do the easy thing, we go with the flow, everyone else, without asking very many questions. And that's what the foolish man does here. Now, as I mentioned, Israel can be very dry, extremely dry in the summer months, but when the winter comes, that's when they have the storms. Right? So the storms there can be downright treacherous, especially for the people who are sitting on this hillside listening to Jesus. They live around the Sea of Galilee in the region of the plains of the Jordan River, which runs up and down there. And so what happens in the winter is they get these really violent storms and the Jordan Plain floods. And so what Jesus is probably referencing here are those storms. They're these violent winter storms with strong winds, torrential downpours that wash away roads, they flood lower portions of towns. These are the storms that Jesus is talking about. So it's very likely, it's possible, that you could build a house on this sand, this really hard rock-feeling, sand in the summer months. And in the winter months, guess what happens to that sand? It gets wet, it gets flooded, and all of it washes away. And guess what washes away with it? Your house. So the storms are a metaphor, right? The house is a metaphor for our lives. The storms are also a metaphor. What are they a metaphor for? Well, we usually talk about them in reference to the hard times that we experience in our life, right? It's like, I'm just going through some storms right now. They're crisis, situations. They're hardship, pain, tragedy. Those are the kind of things that we often ascribe to storms. But the violent winds and torrential downpours that Jesus probably referencing are the day of judgment. That's what makes a lot more sense in the context of what he's talking about here, the day of judgment. This is the same basic idea that Paul has in mind when he writes to the Corinthian church. He says this, according to the grace of God given to me, like a skilled master builder, I laid a foundation, and someone else is building on it. Each builder must choose with care how to build on it, for no one else can lay any foundation other than the one that has been laid. That foundation is Jesus Christ. Now, if anyone builds on that foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, the work of each builder will become visible. For the day, that's a reference to the day of judgment, the day will disclose it, because it will be revealed with fire, and the fire will test what sort of work each has done. If what has been built on the foundation survives, the builder will receive a reward. If the work is burned up, the builder will suffer loss. The builder will be saved, but only as through fire. Now, the builder in this whole discourse is teacher. That's what this text is about. Paul's talking about the work of teachers. But in it, he says, I laid the foundation in you of Christ, of the gospel. So that is the firm foundation of Jesus. He kind of assumes that it's already there, but he's pointing to the same day that Jesus is pointing to. There will be a day when the foundation that we've built our lives on will be examined and tested. And when that day comes, some people's metaphorical house, their life, it will withstand that scrutiny, while others will not come crashing down in an epic fall. So on that positive, encouraging note, let's wrap this thing up, head to City Barbecue. What's the difference between the two builders? One hears the words of Jesus, puts them into practice. And the other hears the words of Jesus, doesn't put them into practice. And that should be a flashing red warning light to everyone sitting here today. A warning light to me, a warning light to you, because we find ourselves in a similar boat as the people who are sitting there listening to this teaching on this hill. People who probably assume, hey, we're good. We're good. Kevin, I've already got this. Now hurry up, because now all I can think about is City Barbecue. No one in this room needs to hear this message this morning, right? Because we're all here. We all brought our kids, grandkids. But Jesus is actually talking to a bunch of people who already assume for one reason or another that they have a solid foundation, like us. It's possible that we've heard the words of Jesus so many times that we've started to assume that because we know them, we're obeying them. But perhaps we've never really come to grips with what Jesus is really calling us into. So as we've said the past 2 weeks, the call to kingdom living, the radical departure from the way that we're wired to and trained to think and act. It's a radical departure from that. So the invitation to discipleship is not something that we just take in stride. Any attempt to do so, to take these words of Jesus and sort of add them to our lives, to sprinkle them into the recipe for happiness and success and fulfillment that we're already following, is doing exactly what the foolish man in this story did. He heard the words of Jesus, maybe thought about them, took a few insights, maybe adjusted one or two things about his life and carried on. That's the foolish man. Jesus is calling disciples who will accept the radical call to kingdom living, which means doing the very difficult work of digging down through hard, packed in, sandy soil to lay a foundation on rock. Because that hard work leads to real heart transformation, not simply more intellectual knowledge, not strict adherence to rules and laws, not lip service Christianity that stops right after verbal profession, but a true transformation of the heart. Jesus reaffirms what he's been saying the whole time, which is that true righteousness that honors God surpasses that of the religious leaders in his day. His sincere trust in our Creator King. Now, here's the thing about trust. I could look out here. I see a lot of people that you're married. You've got a relationship. And you know what? I have no idea if you trust each other. I don't. I mean, how would I? Trust is kind of hard to see, isn't it? In fact, it's hard to measure even in ourselves, let alone looking at somebody else and being like, I'm not sure you trust God. I don't know if you trust God. I don't know if you trust God. Who really knows why you can look at my actions and say, he might. But you don't really know why. You don't know why I do what I do. I don't know why you do what you do. And that makes this whole thing hard. You can't see my foundation. I can't see yours. As a respected theologian John Stott once said, the deep foundations of our lives, they're hidden from view. And that's the brilliance of Jesus' ending here. He's talking about foundations. Very clear, very direct, very personal. So with our remaining time, what I'd like to do is suggest a basic framework that offers some tools that you can use to do some excavating later on. So these are things that might help you think through what you'll do with these clear, direct, and intensely personal words from Jesus. And they're really just two questions that I would really challenge you to take some time and consider and ponder. First one is, what are the assumptions I hold to be true? And then the second is, who or what do I allow to speak authoritatively? We're just going to dive into each of those. That first question, what are the assumptions I hold to be true? That could take you months and possibly years to answer. It's a big question. Leads to a lot of other questions like, what is real? Is there a God? And if so, what is he, she, or it like? Who am I? Why am I here? Where did I come from? What is knowable? What do I believe about history? What do I believe about the future? What's the problem with the world? What's the solution? I mean, these are massive questions, right? Very, very big questions. It requires some deep thought. So don't feel bad if they're daunting to you. You're like, wait a minute. I'm not sure that I've ever asked those questions, and I don't know if I want to. Here's what I would say to you. If we're going to take these words of Jesus seriously, you really need to take some time to sort these things out. What are our answers to some of these questions? Now, here's the kicker. You and I already have answers to these questions. We've already answered them. Our answers come out in the way we live, the decisions we make, the way we spend our time, where we put our money. The evidence is there in terms of what we actually believe. It's already there. We've already answered a lot of these questions because we have a collection of base assumptions that we hold to be true. Our lives are a combination of a bunch of stories that we've already ascribed to. I'll give you an example because most of us in this room have a shared story called the American Dream. It's a story about opportunity, story about success, prosperity, independence, and upward mobility through hard work. That's the American Dream story. It's rooted in some base assumptions that are found in our Declaration of Independence, like all men are created equal and are endowed with their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among them being life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's a story that almost everybody in this room has been force-fed for a long time. And I don't mean force-fed, negatively. I just mean that's spoon-fed, maybe. From infancy, this is a story that we have learned about ourselves. This is who we are as Americans. It's an extremely powerful story that shapes us. And the thing is that it causes us to see the world in a certain way that people in other places in the world maybe don't see it. And people throughout history have not saw it that way either, which begs the question, is that story true? Now, I'm not here to make any commentary on that. I'm just raising the question. Is the story true? It might be, or it might not be. But since these are the core assumptions we're building our lives on, we really should examine them. Don't be afraid to do that. Like Socrates wrote, an unexamined life is not worth living. So the assumptions we hold to be true, they actually inform our beliefs in lots of big categories. I'll give you some examples, and you can kind of see how this thing breaks out. Identity, who am I? What determines my value? It's a great question. Who am I? What determines my value? Purpose, that's another, kind of subcategory. Why am I here? Is there anything worth living for? Morality, that's another category. What is right and wrong? How is it determined? And then destiny. Is there anything beyond this life? What happens when we stop breathing? These are great questions. These are like, just typical worldview questions. If you take a worldview, course in college or something like that, these are some questions that you probably have wrestled with, or that you should have wrestled with. These are kind of some big categories that really shape how we live. Now, around here, we believe in the biblical narrative. We believe that Genesis through Revelation tell one big story about a God who is working to put the world back together. God's story, we believe, is the firm foundation. So, as we teach through the New Testament, like we're doing now through the book of Matthew, what we try to do is tie everything to God's big story. Our children's ministry has written original content that's centered on the story. I've been using it for 2 years, and basically is focused on laying the foundation of God's story in our children. I'm excited to announce this fall our preschool and student ministry will both be launching new curriculums, which are also focused on that same thing of laying the foundation of God's story. Our preschool ministry actually launched that today. Now, if you wonder what in the world I'm talking about, we've written a few overviews of the biblical narrative. One short version is on the website under the What We Believe section, and a longer version, which covers a lot of ground, takes about 15 minutes to read, is available on our Crossview app under the Story tab. So you might want to check that out. That's what we mean when we say God's story. Now, you might have heard us talk about that a lot, because we do, which is, frankly, we talk about the story of God a lot. You wonder why we put such an emphasis on it. And it's because we believe that the big picture understanding of the Bible is necessary for us to grasp the magnitude of who Jesus is, what he came to do, what he's doing now. And I personally believe it provides the most logical answers to the questions that we talked about before, the questions that I've raised here. Therefore, giving us accurate assumptions to build a life on. And that's important. You know why? Because inaccurate assumptions are to a life what heart disease is to a body. Inaccurate assumptions are to a life what heart disease is to a body. Of course, you might not know if you have heart disease. And you might not know you've built your whole life on assumptions that aren't true. So examine them to see if they hold up. And don't be scared about that. Don't be nervous about that. I'm very adamant about this. If this is true, it's true. It can withhold scrutiny. It can stand up to it. So don't be afraid to question it. Don't be afraid to apply some of these questions here. Okay? If it's true, it's true. And I believe it is. So the first question, what are the set of assumptions I hold to be true? The second is, who or what do I allow to speak authoritatively? Who or what do I allow to speak authoritatively? Listen how Matthew wraps this section up. Now, when Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as their scribes. Now, since the last point was kind of complicated, I wanted to make this one as simple as possible, as simple as Jesus intended it to be. Will you hear these words of Jesus and put them into practice? That's the question. So the sermon ends with this invitation to discipleship. Will we follow Jesus, trusting that he is the way back to the Father, or will we choose not to? That's the question that Jesus brings us to. Yes or no? Fork in the road, as Jesus typically does. Now, I'm convinced more and more that the question of Jesus' authority is the precise decision point. That's like what everything else hinges on. Is Jesus authoritative? Which is really asking, is Jesus the Son of God who became a human, who lived a perfect life, suffered, crucified, and then resurrected from the dead? That's the question. If the answer is no, let's go home. And if the answer is yes, then he is authoritatively the Lord, the King over all things. That's the basic outline of the whole thing. And so that's the question. Do you believe that Jesus is authoritative? Will you allow Jesus to be the authoritative voice in your life? See, a big part of this whole examination is determining whether or not you think that there actually is a day of judgment, for instance. Hey, there's a purported day of judgment. Yeah, so says Jesus. I mean, how do we even know that's a thing? Like maybe Jesus is misinformed. Maybe Matthew's making all this stuff up. That's why this second question is important. Who or what do I allow to speak authoritatively into my life? That's exactly where Matthew is going to take us out of this. Over the next 7 weeks, we're going to venture into basically chapters 8 through 17, where Jesus' authority is going to be on full display. What does it mean that Jesus has authority? What exactly does Jesus have authority over? And we'll see some people who are wrestling with that authority. Will you leave everything in order to follow Jesus, or will you not? And what we'll see is that some people say yes, and some people say no. There are some people in here that just flat out say, I don't believe that you're authoritative, Jesus, so I'm not going to lay down my whole life to follow you. And some of you might end up there. I hope not, but you might. Ask the question. The consideration for the end of this teaching was like, does there need to be a big, epic, like hearty, kind of thing at the end? It's like compelling you to follow Jesus. And I decided no. And the reason is because Jesus doesn't do that. He just lays out this story and says, will you follow me or will you not? Will you build your house? Will you take these words and put them into practice or will you not? I'm a very heart-oriented person. I really believe in the heart. I think the emotions are God-given. They're very important. I'm not going to make an emotional appeal because I also believe that God gave us brains. He gave us intellect, knowledge. And that, to me, is a lot of what this is. It is truly an examination, a deep dive into who we are and what we actually believe. What are the stories that we have ascribed to that have shaped our decisions and how we live? How do we end up where we are in our lives right now? Is that where we want to be? Is that where we should be? Can your worldview answer these questions that we've raised adequately? I believe, and we believe, as a community, that Jesus is the fulfillment of everything that God has been working to do throughout all of history. We look at Jesus, we see the culmination of God's heart, we see the culmination of God's purpose, and Jesus invites us to come into this relationship with God, to come back to this trust that we were designed to have in the beginning with God. And so the options are yes or no. Yes or no. And so I would challenge you to explore that. Think about that. Contemplate it. Pray about it. Where are you? Have you submitted your life to the kingship of Jesus?